So we are in our third week of a short series on serving here at East Hills. Earlier this month, at the start of the new learning year, we considered how learning and being open to the possibility that we have blind spots when it comes to living out our Christian faith. We said that's an act of serving God, learning as an act of serving God. Last week, we explored faith in action and in action. The Christian faith is far more than words of a creed, and our faith is not to be parked permanently on some dead-end street, we said. It is meant to go somewhere. It needs an outlet. What we believe in our head, what we feel in our heart, moves into some form of action. We come to today's readings from the book of James and the Gospel of Mark. And if our call to serve involves learning about our blind spots, and if our call to serve is about faith in action rather than faith that remains parked on a dead-end street, then perhaps today, as we consider the relationship between serving and humility, we might say humility has to do with our growing capacity to yield to the ways of God. If we think about serving in general, the two, humility and service, seem to go together very well. But it's living into that humility that becomes a challenge, because it's not a virtue or a way that is always highly valued in our culture. If humility is likened to yielding, just one trip down Route 378 from Coopersburg to Bethlehem will help us understand and reveal how well and willing people are willing to yield. Just a clue, it's not very good. And I include myself in that sometimes. Our society seems to say, move ahead. Our society seems to say, hop on the escalator that is going up. Climb the ladder to success. While Christianity teaches that our aim is to move in the opposite way, to the last, to the least, and the lost. Jesus himself sets this example for all who follow him. Now, probably one of the most humbling things we can do in our interactions with other people is to ask questions. Young children do this really well. Why do dogs wag their tails? Where does the sun go at bedtime? How many stars are there? Why did God make mosquitoes and stink bugs? Where do babies come from? These questions and others like them are the kinds of things children ask all the time. They have a natural capacity for wonder, and early on, no need to be right, no need to be best, no fear of being judged ignorant or judged at all. You see that, you just jump off the steps when you want to jump off the steps. Asking questions for us is one way we learn, right? About the world around us, about people around us. But isn't it true, sometimes adults struggle to ask questions? Somewhere along the line in our human growth and development, we become uncomfortable with what we do not know and what we do not understand. There's a certain humility involved. There's a risk in admitting, I don't know. Knowledge is power, they say, and power is so often associated with greatness in our culture. No one wants to be perceived as ignorant or made to feel small. And so rather than risk being judged, sometimes we just don't ask. We just don't ask the hard questions. In our reading from the book of James, the writer describes two kinds of wisdom. One comes from humility, a life submitted to God, a life that draws near to God. But there's also what James calls worldly wisdom, which is really human foolishness in disguise. It causes quarrels and fights, and the key difference is motivation. James asks the church Is the wisdom applied aimed at advancing God's agenda or our own? Does the wisdom seek deeper connection with God and others, or is the motivation to elevate ourselves to being right? There doesn't seem to be any middle ground, according to James. Humility is part of what it means to serve God. Either you're on that escalator going up like the rest of the world, or headed in the opposite direction in humble service to the last and the least and the lost. In the reading from the Gospel of Mark, Jesus tells his disciples for a second time of his passion prediction. He said, "The Son of Man will be betrayed into human hands. They will kill him, and 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But the disciples did not understand what Jesus was saying, and they were afraid to ask. It's really too bad there weren't any small children among them at the time. Because undoubtedly a child, someone without a huge ego, someone who had no need to know it all, someone who was not ashamed at what they did not know, someone who did not fear being judged, they would have asked some questions of Jesus. Children perhaps would have said, "Who is the Son of Man? What is betrayal?" And the all-important question a 4-year-old will ask, "Why?" Confused and afraid, the disciples kept quiet. Jesus tells them of his passion predictions, but the disciples did not understand, and to be fair, how could they have understood what Jesus was talking about? At that point in their journey together, they were just beginning to grasp who Jesus was. This follows Peter's confession of faith and the transfiguration, and the disciples at this point are thinking maybe, just maybe, Jesus was the Messiah. And they're thinking warrior, they're thinking liberator, the one they had been waiting for. But what was all this talk about death and rising again? Those seem like hard questions. And the disciples didn't ask. But certainly Jesus knew of their confusion. And here he seems to connect their silence, the silence of the disciples, with the argument following concerning who was the greatest among them. Perhaps because when people avoid asking hard questions, we are tempted to assume we are right. We are tempted to assume what we know. And knowledge, according to worldly wisdom, is power. As the disciples jockey for their place and greatness, Jesus offers another posture, one of humility, as he scoops up a child into his arms, places that child in the center of the conversation, a child, small, vulnerable, powerless in that day and time, dependent upon the grace of others to live. All humble qualities, all qualities of greatness, according to Jesus. By his actions, Jesus shows his followers that humble service means uplifting another so that they are seen and not overlooked. They are heard and not dismissed. Jesus illustrates this true greatness by putting others first. It's being less concerned with their own importance and their own agendas. I had to giggle a little bit because I had a story I wanted to tell those kids this morning, and I had to kind of submit to what was going on, right? I couldn't control that. Here in this Bible passage, Jesus illustrates greatness is putting others first. It's being less concerned with our own agendas, helping others to see their own importance, placing others front and center, especially those who are vulnerable. That, Jesus says, is where true greatness is found, and it is humbling work. When we think about the illustration Jesus used and children in our own context, we might consider, and this is not a stretch at all today, we might consider how children often giggle and wiggle. And when you try to make them conform, It doesn't work really well, does it? When we try to have a child sitting for an hour quietly in the pew of the sanctuary, it just doesn't work. We love them, but sometimes we have to admit, small children can be messy, they can be impatient, they can need a lot of attention and love in order to flourish and thrive. They don't necessarily fit in well to any expectation of neat and orderly ministry. So if we're serious about wanting kids to know Christ, we need to ask questions. We need to listen to parents. What is it their kids need? What do they need, rather than assuming we know or expecting them to meet our own expectations? And to take that one step further, I wonder how that translates to our ministry as a whole. Who might it be that Jesus would uplift and put in our midst so we might humble ourselves and see and ask the hard questions? Who might Jesus uplift and put in our midst so we might be willing to listen and understand them? Would it be a young person struggling with gender identity who needs to be heard, someone to listen and ask questions for the sake of understanding? Would it be the elderly or people who have infirmities who need to be seen and heard and not dismissed or overlooked? Would it be the person who is on the other side of the political aisle, who we are called to humble ourselves and ask questions for the sake of truly understanding? What if we lived our lives as if what Jesus said about greatness and humility were true? What if we ordered our priorities in a way that put others and their concerns front and center? First, recipients of our time, of our money, of our energy, of our patience and love. What if we risked engaging others, asking hard questions, and then dared to listen, to seek and understand? What if we lived as if the measure of greatness was in how much we share, how much we care, how deeply and sincerely we love, how able we are to yield to God's ways for the sake of love of the other? Friends, imagine that just for a moment. Wouldn't that be truly great? Amen.